Time Crisis. Does that bring back memories for you? Perhaps memories of being in an arcade, the lobby of a theater, or a gaming convention? Odds are, if you're under the age of about 20, Time Crisis means about as much to you as the Maltese Falcon means to a 30-year-old. But that shouldn't stop you from seeking it out and enjoying it if you can. Time Crisis was born into a world where arcades were still somewhat easy to find, and light guns were still laying around in game rooms and man caves all around the world. 1995 was an interesting time for gaming, as the 16-bit generation was on the way out and jagged polygons were in. Did mouths move when characters talked? Did hands have fingers yet? Well, not usually, but the fact that the characters were in 3D and moving around in a world that seemed somewhat similar to our own was more than enough for us. This was the age of the on-rails light gun shooter. The House of the Dead, Virtua Cop, and other similar games would flourish in this time. Was the technology new? Of course not. Light games were a thing long before the mid-90s. The real credit for that goes to Duck Hunt and Operation Wolf for popularizing that particular strand of excellence in gaming. But the twist that was being added in the 90s was the ability for characters to move around in a polygonal world all their own, while the player managed ammo, health, and the like. As unremarkable as that may seem to gamers in 2019, 25 years ago, this was a sight to behold. And as such, the genre was extremely popular for a period of time. Time Crisis, being one of the top contenders in the fight for arcade-goers' attention, saw several sequels and plenty of notoriety to go along with it. So, what happened? Why did this excellent series blow itself off the face of the earth? What the hell happened to Time Crisis? Well, the writing was on the wall. Consoles hadn't quite killed off the arcades by 1995. Many companies like Sega, Atari, and Namco were still seeing lots of revenue from arcades and still had a few tricks up their sleeves to keep arcades interesting and worthwhile for players who, more often than not, had consoles at home that could produce similar, if not superior, experiences to the arcades. One of the higher standpoint of the arcade industry was the on-rails light gun shooter. Most had only a simple yet cool cheap gun that you would face at the screen, while others implemented more expensive additional tech like motion trackers to track the player's physical movements and simulate taking cover. Time Crisis fell somewhere in between, with a minimalist foot pedal that would be stepped on by the player to enter a fight and released to return to cover and reload. This turned out to be quite an elegant mechanic that was largely kept intact throughout the series, with only some minor tweaks here and there. On top of that, the hook with Time Crisis was the limited amount of time that each area needed to be completed in, and by completed, I mean all the enemies killed. That was really all there was to it. As the series went on, story elements got a little more complex, but all in all, the series stayed true to the original save the world and kill the bad guy before things blow up type stories. There was never very much beyond a very surface-level reason to be playing these games, and for the time, that was fine. Get in there and kill the bad guys generally summed up every mission in these games, and the player always had what he or she needed to get it done. This simplicity is what made so much sense in the mid-90s, but also what drove the series into a corner later on. Fundamentally, Time Crisis comes down to efficiency. Anybody can beat the levels if they take their time and peek out of cover for seconds at a time, picking off baddies one by one. But that strategy would take time, and as you might expect in a game called Time Crisis, time is not something that you can really take for granted. As the games progressed, more enemies with better aim and deadlier weapons would appear, thusly taking more time to kill and forcing the player to get better and better to survive. It was a pretty nice system that kept players engaged and shelling out quarters for at least a few years. Despite the first game being a little rough around the edges, Time Crisis quickly took off in the hearts and minds of patrons of the arcades. Especially the sequel, the aptly named Time Crisis 2, which garnered awards, saw a port to the PlayStation 2 with jazzed up visuals, and saw higher review scores than most light gun games were used to seeing from major review outlets. The improved shooting and ability to cooperate with a friend were just part of why TC2 took off, as it was really an all-around great game, and an example of how fun a silly on-rails light gun game could be when developed by the right people. As you might expect, subsequent sequels to Time Crisis were excellent games as well, and further tweaked the formula by adding weapons, deepening the cover system, and creating a larger story. While the more intricate story is hardly something the series needed, tweaks to the combat and cover system were largely welcome additions, and Time Crisis lived well past the relevancy of its genre, and arcades themselves. Today, arcades are largely banished to theater lobbies, entertainment restaurants, and the handful of shopping malls that still have enough foot traffic to keep themselves comfortably profitable. So with the evolution of gamers largely staying home to play, so goes the franchises that thrived with audiences that weren't looking for a story or long gaming sessions. No game publisher was blind to this trend, and many on-rail light gun shooters begrudgingly made their transition to console. House of the Dead was one of the more successful franchises to pull this off, but Time Crisis bought itself quite a bit of time as well, with great versions of the games on PlayStation 2 and 3. While all of the entries in the main series were received at least relatively well, the newest iteration was particularly impressive with the most stages and largest areas of any of the previous installments. While 2015's Time Crisis 5 has yet to see a console port, it's still regarded as a success from a financial and critical standpoint. Unfortunately, with a franchise so tailor-made for the arcades, and with any deviation from that style risking feeling too much like a departure, Time Crisis finds itself in a bit of a difficult spot today. Should the franchise stick to its guns and continue to risk Namco's neck by relying on a dying arcade industry? Or should it morph into whatever it needs to be in order to compete with modern console gamers' expectations? Either choice sounds like a lousy uphill battle that I don't blame Namco for choosing to abstain from for the time being. Maybe the few mobile spin-offs of the series are where the future for the franchise lies. Or perhaps it's possible that Time Crisis has finally run out its own clock. Only time will tell. And that wraps it up. If you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing to our channel. We upload new videos daily. Also, don't forget to switch on the bell notification icon, that way you don't miss out on any of our videos.